Fab, who do you have as your second matchup you hate for the week?
I got Mr. Patrick Mahomes versus the Saints. He's without his running back one. He's without his wide receiver one. He's without his wide receiver two. Versus the Saints D that held Dak, Hurts, and Cousins to a combined 36 fantasy points, which is roughly 12 points per. So it's hard to be excited starting Mahomes versus the Saints D that's giving up the fourth fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks. Despite that, Mahomes hasn't exactly been lighting it up the score sheet either. He's less yards and TDs thrown than this time last year, and he's yet to hit 20 points this season. 20 fantasy points this season. I think that trend continues, and I'm downgrading Mahomes to a QB2 this week.
Fab, let's move on to your loves this week. Speaking of a lot of love.
Yeah, I love me some Jordan Love this week. He has a great matchup versus the Rams, giving up the second most fantasy points to quarterbacks. Last week, Love finished as QB1 overall, 35 points. And while I'm not sure he can come close to those numbers this week, because we don't know what the game script is going to be if they get ahead pretty early, I still think he's going to have an excellent, excellent game versus the Rams. Despite not having Christian Watson, I still expect a big game from him and the rest of the Packers pass catchers. But just in general, though, side note, I think Love can actually go on a tear in the next 4 weeks. He has a very favorable schedule coming up. He faces the Rams, obviously. Second best matchup. Then he goes to Arizona, 10th best. Houston, fourth best. And Jacksonville, third best. So the next 4 games for him can be stellar by the
First, Josh Downs at the Jaguars. Whether it's Flacco or Richardson, I really like Downs in this matchup. He had 9 targets, 8 catches, 82 yards, a touchdown, and a 30% target share last week against what I think we all would consider an elite defense in the Steelers. So I think he's an easy flex option against the Jags.
Yeah, my only concern is that the entirety of the game it was Flacco that was playing. So if Richardson plays, I'm not sure he can, because we know, like, I don't know if Richardson can sustain a proper wide receiver, to be honest with you. Right, absolutely.
My second love this week, I wanted to go against the grain. This is your boy Fab, whatever name you want to call him, name it withheld, Towel Man, Massage Watson, which is my favorite.
Bed Bath and Beyond's favorite customer. Is that who this is? Go against
Keeping
the
them
grain.
in business, baby. Keeping them in business.
Go against the grain.
You can ask his massage therapist if he goes against the grain, if you know what I mean.
Oh boy.
Should I continue? Want to?
Raj, maybe give your reasoning, Raj.
Look, he hasn't been as bad as we think he's been.
Is it because there's no massage parlors in Washington? Is that why he's going to do well? He's going to be focused on the game. Okay, I'm done.
Look, Fab, who do you got for your?
We're going to continue with the Jets. I got Breece Hall against the Vikings as one of my hates this week. I mean, obviously, you're most likely starting Breece Hall, but you're going to obviously have to temper your expectations. The Vikings are actually giving up the fourth fewest points to opposing running backs and have allowed 1 rushing touchdown all year. They've been a powerhouse on both sides of the ball, and if the game gets out of hand early, Rodgers might need to throw it more, which will obviously limit Breece's involvement. I don't see Hall putting up those RB1 numbers this week like you normally would expect.
So my first matchup that I hate this week is Bengals backfield versus the Ravens. The Ravens have the 4th best defense against the run from a fantasy perspective, and they have not allowed a single rusher to go over 50 yards in the game. So they're looking like the vaunted defense that we know and love, led by Roquan Smith and Kyle Hamilton. I know Chase Brown, Zach Moss had a really strong performance together against the Panthers, but it's still a split committee. It's hard to know who to trust between those two guys. Moss is the consensus 24th running back on Fantasy Pros, Brown the consensus 27th. And I personally think there are better options if you want more of a RB2 flex play, and even Justice Hill and Tank Bigsby who have better matchups. So I would avoid both those guys this week. Knack, who do you have as your first matchup that you love for this week?
Yeah, so the first matchup I love this week is going to be Justin Fields at home versus the Cowboys on Sunday Night Football. Fun fact about this game, these two storied franchises, the first time they meet on Sunday Night Football, which I found strange.
Yeah,
but
I just read that before the episode. I thought that was interesting too.
First time they meet at Sunday Night Football. So Fields has clearly established himself as the QB1 in Pittsburgh and as a QB1 in fantasy football. Started off slow, but back-to-back games of 20.4 and then 32 point, almost 33 points this last week. Dallas is also going to be shorthanded on D, so notably no DeMarcus Lawrence, defensive end, and then Micah Parsons is also going to be missing the games. Um, but that being said, they need someone to step up in that offense, and there's going to be Worthy and Hardman who figure to see some bigger target share, even Juju. But the biggest benefactor, I think, will be Kelce. He saw 9 targets in Week 4, so that was the most of the season by almost double. And I think that trend continues going forward. The Saints are also giving up the 5th most fantasy points to tight ends at this point. So great news for the people who drafted Kelce high. I would expect very productive Monday Night Football. I'm seeing somewhere along the lines of like 10 to 12 targets.
Second one, this one's a tough one because he's been on such a wagon and such a roll this year, but don't like the matchup at all with Alvin Kamara against the Chiefs. He's going to be meeting Mr. Chris Jones and George Karlaftis, who have probably one of the best fronts in the league from a run defense perspective. So this is the NFL's second leading rush defense, and they've allowed the second least fantasy points per game to running backs. You might think that they'll be more susceptible to the running back reception game with Kamara, but they're also allowing the fewest catches to running backs from a fantasy perspective or just overall perspective in the league as well. So you're starting Kamara either way, but I think this is one where it's really hard to expect the typical RB1 numbers as good as he's been so far this year.
My first hate of the week is going to be Deontay Johnson at the Bears. He's had back-to-back great games after a QB change with the Red Rifle, with 26.2 and 21.3 points respectively the last 2 weeks. However, he gets a Bears D, giving up the 6th fewest points to wide receivers at the given time. The defense is incredibly daunting, and besides the 27 points that they gave up to Nico Collins, no other wide receiver has reached more than 8 points all year. So I think Johnson struggles in Week 5 and might not reach double-digit fantasy points this week.
So Miami D, not to pour salt on the wound here, but they've been giving up the 4th most fantasy points to running backs. They've surrendered 7 rushing touchdowns in 4 weeks and are giving up about 5 yards per carry. Pollard and Spears gashed their defense last night, and with Miami traveling on a short-ish week, I think Ramondre has a pretty good game. I think this equals some more touches for Stevenson, which equals an excellent fantasy production outing. So Stevenson, I think, can get into the low-end RB1 numbers this week.
My only pushback on this one, Fab, is the offensive line is really bad on both sides, whether from a pass blocking and run blocking perspective. I agree the Finns defense has been struggling, but I'd be wary of them stacking the box and forcing Jacoby to throw, and that has been an absolute disaster on its own. So.
Yeah, so my second hate this week is going to be Aaron Rodgers versus Minnesota. Of course, as you guys might have guessed, that game is in London this week. He also was on McAfee today and saying that he has swelling in his knee as well, so he's got a little bit of an injury going on also. But look, he does get a familiar foe in the Minnesota Vikings. Obviously, spent 17 years in that division. But unfortunately, I believe he's going to struggle for a second week in a row. So Week 4 aside, the Vikings have been very stingy to opposing QBs, giving up the 8th fewest fantasy points.